Welcome to Story Tales. Please like this video and subscribe to Story Tales. I hope you enjoy the story. Let's begin. David Callahan wiped grease from his hands with a worn shop rag, watching his 11-year-old niece Lainey sketch in the corner of his auto shop office. She sat cross-legged on the old leather couch, her dark hair falling like a curtain around her face as she worked. The weekend had passed too quickly. "Time to pack up, kiddo," David said, his voice gentle. "Your mom will be here soon." Lainey's pencil stopped moving. Her small shoulders tensed, and she closed the sketchbook with a quiet snap. "I know." She stood slowly, gathering her few belongings into a worn backpack. Her movements were careful, measured, like she was trying not to disturb the air around her. David studied her face. Something was wrong. Had been wrong for months now, ever since Caleb's funeral. Lainey used to laugh, used to run through his shop asking endless questions about engines and tools. Now she moved like a ghost. "You okay, sweetheart?" She nodded without looking up, but her hands shook as she zipped the backpack. "Lainey," David knelt down to her level. "Talk to me." For a moment, her dark eyes met his. In them, he saw something that made his chest tight fear. Pure, raw fear from a child who should never have to feel it. "I don't want to go home," she whispered, so quiet he almost missed it. The words hit him like a punch. David reached out, but before he could respond, the shop door chimed. Melinda Pierce walked in, her blonde hair perfectly styled, wearing a bright smile that never reached her eyes. "There's my baby girl." Melinda's voice carried that fake sweetness David had grown to hate. "Ready to go home?" Lainey transformed instantly. Her back straightened, her face went blank, and she nodded quickly. "Yes, Mom." "Good. Thank Uncle David for letting you stay over." Melinda's blue eyes found David's, and he saw something cold lurking beneath the surface. "Thank you, Uncle David," Lainey said, her voice flat now. David stood, his jaw tight. "She's welcome anytime." "How sweet." Melinda's smile stretched wider. "But she has school tomorrow. Can't have her falling behind." Something in her tone made David's skin crawl. He watched as Lainey walked toward her mother, each step slower than the last. When she reached Melinda's side, she flinched slightly as her mother's hand landed on her shoulder. "Say goodbye, honey." Lainey turned back to David, and for just a second, her composure cracked. She rushed forward and wrapped her thin arms around his waist, holding on tight. "I love you, Uncle David," she whispered against his shirt. "I love you too, kiddo." He hugged her back, feeling how small she was, how fragile. "Come on, Lainey. We need to go." Melinda's voice had an edge now. As they walked toward the door, Melinda stopped beside David. She pressed something into his palm, a folded piece of paper. "For you," she said, her smile returning. "Something to remember." Then they were gone, leaving David standing in his empty shop with the paper burning in his hand. He unfolded it slowly. The handwriting was Melinda's, neat and controlled. "She's lying again. Don't believe anything she says. She needs discipline. Mind your business." David's hands clenched into fists, crumpling the note. Through the shop window, he watched Melinda's car pull away. In the back seat, Lainey's small face stared back at him, and he saw tears streaming down her cheeks. "Son of a bitch," he muttered, his Marine training keeping his voice steady even as rage built in his chest. The next morning, David sat in his office before dawn, surrounded by papers and files. Coffee had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. The note from Melinda lay on his desk, smooth flat, its words burning into his memory. She needs discipline. His brother Caleb's funeral photo stared back at him from the desk, young, smiling, full of life. Dead at 34 in a car crash that never made sense. David pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in months. "Jamie? It's David Callahan. We need to talk." 2 hours later, Jamie Rodriguez sat across from David in a diner on the outskirts of Boise. Caleb's former co-worker looked tired, older than his 35 years. "I've been wondering when you'd call," Jamie said, stirring his coffee. "Been thinking about Caleb a lot lately." "Tell me about the weeks before he died," David said. "Everything you remember." Jamie's eyes darted around the empty diner. "Man, I don't know if I should. My niece is in trouble, Jamie. I think it's connected to Caleb's death." That got Jamie's attention. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. What kind of trouble? The kind that makes an 11-year-old girl afraid to go home. Jamie's face darkened. Jesus. Okay, yeah. He was messed up those last few weeks. Kept saying Melinda was acting strange. Staying out late, getting calls she wouldn't take in front of him. Did he think she was cheating? Think? Hell, he knew. Confronted her about it 2 weeks before the crash. Said she laughed in his face, told him he was paranoid. Jamie paused, rubbing his forehead. But here's the thing, Caleb wasn't paranoid. He was one of the most level-headed guys I knew. David pulled out a small notebook. What else? The night before he died, he called me. Said he'd found something, some kind of proof. Wanted to show me the next day. Jamie's voice dropped to a whisper. He never got the chance. What about the crash? You were first on scene, right? Yeah, along with the tow truck. Jamie's expression grew troubled. That was weird too. The tow showed up before we even called for one. Driver said he heard the crash, but that stretch of road, it's isolated. No houses nearby. Who was the driver? Guy named Declan Rudd. Owns Rudd Towing. Kind of a cold bastard, but efficient. Jamie met David's eyes. He moved that car fast, man. Faster than normal. Like he was in a hurry. David wrote down the name, his jaw tightening. Anything else seem off? The car. Caleb was a mechanic. He kept his vehicle in perfect condition. But the brake lines... Jamie shook his head. They were shot. Completely corroded. Didn't make sense for a car that had been serviced 6 months earlier. Where are the service records? That's just that they're missing. Caleb always kept copies of everything, but his files at home and work were cleaned out after the funeral. Melinda said she threw them away. David's pen stopped moving. She threw away his work files, said she couldn't stand looking at them. Too painful. Jamie's voice carried doubt. But Caleb loved those cars. It would be like throwing away pieces of him. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of implications settling between them. David, Jamie said finally, if what you're thinking is true, if Melinda and this Declan guy, what are you going to do? David closed his notebook and stood. Whatever it takes to protect my niece. Be careful, man. If they killed Caleb, then they picked the wrong family to mess with. That afternoon, David drove to the Boise Police Department. The desk sergeant directed him to a cramped office where Detective Nico Lastra sat reviewing case files. Detective Lastra? I'm David Callahan. I want to reopen my brother's case. Lastra looked up from his paperwork, a tired-looking man in his 40s with intelligent dark eyes. Callahan. Caleb Callahan. The vehicle fatality from last year? That's right. Have a seat. Lastra gestured to a worn chair. What makes you think there's more to investigate? David pulled out his notebook and started talking. He told Lastra about Jamie's statement, about the missing service records, about the tow truck driver who arrived too fast. When he finished, Lastra was leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled. These are interesting observations, Mr. Callahan, but there's more. David's voice was steady, controlled. I think my sister-in-law is abusing my niece, and I think it's connected. Lastra's expression sharpened. That's a serious accusation. I'm a serious man, detective. For a long moment, they studied each other. Finally, Lastra nodded. Okay, let me pull the original file. But I'll warn you, if this case was closed clean, there better be damn good reason to reopen it. There is, David said, a little girl who's too afraid to go home. David was locking up the shop Tuesday evening when he noticed Elaine's sketchbook sitting on the office couch where she'd left it. His first instinct was to call Melinda, but something held him back. Maybe it was the note she'd given him, or the fear in Laney's eyes, or just the feeling that had been eating at him since Sunday. He picked up the sketchbook, running his thumb over the worn cover. Laney had always been artistic, even as a small child. Caleb used to joke that she got her talent from some mystery ancestor, since nobody else in the family could draw a straight line. David hesitated. This was Laney's private space, her thoughts and feelings made visible. But the fear in her voice when she'd whispered, "I don't want to go home," echoed in his memory. He opened the cover. The first few pages were normal flowers, houses, a sketch of a shop. But as he turned the pages, the drawings changed. A woman with wild hair and an open mouth, clearly screaming. A small figure huddled under a bed while shadows loomed above. arms covered in dark marks that looked suspiciously like bruises. David's hand started to shake. The drawings grew darker as he continued. A kitchen scene with broken dishes scattered across the floor. A child's bedroom with a chair wedged under the doorknob. And on every page, the same small figure always hiding, always afraid. Near the end of the sketchbook, one image made David's blood run cold. A tombstone with Dad carved into it, and beneath it, a tiny figure with tears streaming down her face. Above the figure, written in a child's careful handwriting, "Sorry, Jesus Christ," David whispered. He closed the book and sat down hard on the couch. His mind raced, connecting dots he didn't want to connect. Lainey blaming herself for Caleb's death. The abuse hidden in these pages. Melinda's note telling him not to believe anything Lainey said. His phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. David? It's Charmaine Booker, Melinda's neighbor. David knew Charmaine, a retired teacher who'd lived next to Caleb and Melinda for years. She'd spoken at Caleb's funeral about what a good father he'd been. "Hi, Charmaine. What can I do for you?" "Well, I hate to bother you, but have you noticed anything strange about Lainey lately?" David's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "I don't want to speak out of turn, but I've been hearing things. From next door. Loud voices crying. And it's not grief crying, David. It's different." "What kind of voices?" Charmaine's voice dropped to a whisper. "Melinda's screaming at that little girl, saying terrible things. And there's a man over there most nights now, that Declan fellow who owns the tow truck business. He's not kind to Lainey either." David closed his eyes. "How long has this been going on?" "Since right after the funeral. Maybe before. I've been wanting to call someone, but I wasn't sure. I mean, Melinda puts on such a good show in public." "Charmaine, have you seen any physical signs?" "Bruises, cuts. That's just it I have. Last week I saw Lainey in the backyard, and her arms." Charmaine's voice broke. "David, I think that woman is hurting her. And that Declan character, he just stands there and lets it happen. Sometimes he even laughs." David stood up, pacing now. "Why are you calling me?" "Because you're the only family that little girl has left. And because I can't stand by and watch this anymore. I tried talking to Melinda once, asked if everything was okay. She smiled that plastic smile of hers and told me Lainey was going through a difficult phase. Said the girl was acting out because she missed her father. But you don't believe that. I was a teacher for 30 years, David. I know the difference between grief and terror. That child is terrified." David looked down at the sketchbook in his hand. "Charmaine, I need you to do something for me. Keep watching. Keep listening. And if you see anything at all, you call me immediately." "Of course." "But David, what are you going to do?" David's voice was steady, cold. "Whatever it takes." After hanging up, David sat in the growing darkness of his office, the sketchbook open in his lap. The last drawing stared up at him, that tiny figure beside Caleb's grave, taking responsibility for something no child should ever blame themselves for. He thought about Melinda's note. She needs discipline. He thought about Declan Rudd showing up too fast at Caleb's crash scene. He thought about missing service records and corroded brake lines and a little girl who flinched when her mother touched her. David pulled out his phone and dialed Detective Lastra's number. "Lastra. Detective, it's David Callahan. I found something you need to see." "What kind of something?" David looked down at the sketchbook, at years of hidden pain drawn in a child's careful hand. "Evidence," he said, "and it changes everything." David met Detective Lastra at the police station the next morning, the sketchbook tucked under his arm like evidence in a murder case, which he was beginning to suspect it might be. "Let me see what you found," Lastra said, settling behind his desk with a cup of coffee. David opened the sketchbook and spread it across the detective's desk. Lastra's expression grew darker with each page he turned. "Jesus," Lastra muttered, stopping at the drawing of the woman screaming. "You think this is her mother?" "I know it is. Look at the hair, the facial structure. And this." David pointed to a drawing of a large man with cold eyes standing in a doorway. "I think that's Declan Rudd." Lastra studied the image. "The tow truck driver from your brother's crash. The same. And according to my neighbor, he's been spending nights at Melinda's house since right after the funeral. These drawings, they tell a story." Lastra's voice was grim. but they're not enough for a conviction. We need more. David leaned forward. What kind of more? Recordings, photographs, medical records showing injuries. Lastra met David's eyes. Something that will hold up in court. How do I get that? Lastra was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing his words. Officially? You report suspected abuse to Child Protective Services and let them handle it. And unofficially, CPS is overworked and understaffed. Sometimes evidence has a way of disappearing, especially if the right people get involved. Lastra's expression was careful, neutral. But I can't advise you to take matters into your own hands. David understood. Lastra couldn't tell him to gather evidence himself, but he wasn't telling him not to either. If someone were to hypothetically obtain recordings of abuse, what would you do with them? Hypothetically, I'd be very interested in such recordings, especially if they corroborated other evidence in an ongoing investigation. David nodded. I understand. Be careful, Callahan. If your suspicions are correct, you're dealing with people who've already killed once. That afternoon, David drove to an electronics store on the other side of town. He paid cash for a small digital camera with audio recording capability, the kind that could be easily hidden. The plan was simple. Lainey was supposed to stay with him again this weekend. When she left on Sunday, the camera would go with her hidden in her backpack. If Melinda was abusing her, David would have proof. But first, he needed to talk to Lainey. Friday evening, Melinda dropped Lainey off at the shop. She barely spoke to David, just handed over a small duffel bag and left with a curt "See you Sunday." Lainey seemed even more withdrawn than before. She sat on the couch in his office, hugging her knees to her chest, staring at nothing. You forgot something last time, David said gently, holding up her sketchbook. For the first time all evening, Lainey looked up. Her eyes went wide with panic. Did you look at it? David sat down beside her. I did, and I need you to know something. None of this is your fault. Tears started flowing down Lainey's cheeks. You don't understand. Dad died because of me, because I was bad. That's not true, sweetheart. Your dad died because someone hurt him, someone who wanted him gone. Mom says, your mom is lying. David's voice was firm but gentle. Lainey, what happened to your dad wasn't an accident. And what's happening to you isn't discipline. It's wrong, and it needs to stop. Lainey buried her face in her knees. She says if I tell anyone, they'll take me away and put me somewhere worse. She says nobody will believe me anyway. David's hands clenched into fists, but he kept his voice calm. Do you trust me? A small nod. Then trust me when I say I'm going to fix this. But I need your help. He showed her the tiny camera, explaining how it worked or to hide it. Lainey listened with the solemn attention of a child who'd grown up too fast. Will it hurt her? Lainey asked. It will stop her from hurting you. What about Declan? David's jaw tightened. Him too. Sunday morning came too quickly. As Melinda's car pulled up outside the shop, David knelt down to Lainey's level. Remember what we talked about? You're not alone anymore, okay. Lainey nodded, her small hand patting the backpack where the camera was hidden. I remember. And Lainey? You're the bravest kid I know. For the first time in months, she almost smiled. 3 days later, David retrieved the camera from where Lainey had hidden it in the school bathroom during lunch. His hand shook as he connected it to his laptop in the shop office. The footage was worse than he'd imagined. Melinda screaming at Lainey about homework, calling her stupid, worthless, shoving her hard enough to send the small girl stumbling into a wall. And Declan in the background, arms crossed, watching with cold amusement. She's old enough to handle worse, Declan's voice said from the speakers. The audio was clear, damning. But it was the look on Melinda's face that made David's blood run, cold, pure rage directed at a defenseless child. He made copies of everything and called Detective Lastra. The Child Protective Services office was a gray, depressing building that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. David sat across from caseworker Janet Mills, a harried-looking woman in her 50s who seemed more interested in her paperwork than the evidence he'd brought. Mr. Callahan, these are serious allegations, Mills said, barely glancing at the camera footage on her computer screen. But we need to follow proper protocol. You just watched a woman assault an 11-year-old child. What more protocol do you need? Mills sighed. We need to interview all parties involved. We need to conduct a home visit. We need to review medical records and school reports. How long does that take? These things can't be rushed. A few weeks, maybe a month. David leaned forward. In a month, that little girl could be dead. Mr. Callahan, I understand you're concerned, but making dramatic statements won't help anyone. David wanted to grab the woman by the shoulders and shake her, but he forced himself to stay calm. What happens now? We'll schedule interviews with Melinda Pierce and the child. We'll conduct a home inspection. If we find evidence of abuse, we'll take appropriate action. And until then, the child remains in her current placement. David left the CPS office with a sick feeling in his stomach. But Detective Lastra had warned him this might happen. The system was designed to protect families. Even when families were the source of danger. 2 weeks later, Mills called with the results of their investigation. Mr. Callahan, we've completed our review of the Pierce case, and we found no evidence of abuse. The case is being closed. David's phone creaked in his grip. You found no evidence? I gave you video footage. Mrs. Pierce explained that the footage was taken out of context. She was disciplining her daughter for dangerous behavior running into traffic, apparently. She provided character references from teachers, neighbors, and friends. Everyone spoke very highly of her parenting. What about the injuries in the medical records? Normal childhood accidents. A fall from her bicycle. A slip in the bathroom. The school nurse confirmed that Lainey is clumsy and accident-prone. David's vision went red. Accident-prone. Mrs. Pierce also expressed concerns about your mental health, Mr. Callahan. She mentioned that you've been suffering from PTSD since your military service, and that you've been making increasingly erratic accusations since your brother's death. She said what? She's worried that your grief has affected your judgment. She's concerned about you having unsupervised access to Lainey. The line went quiet for a long moment. Mr. Callahan, are you there? I'm here, David said, his voice deadly calm. We recommend that you seek counseling for your grief, and perhaps limit your contact with the Pierce family until you've had time to heal. David hung up without another word. That evening, he called Charmaine Booker. David, is everything okay? You sound strange. CPS closed the case. They bought Melinda's story. What? But I told them what I heard. I gave them a statement. What statement? The caseworker came by last week. I told her everything, the screaming, the crying, the bruises I've seen. She said she'd include it in her report. David closed his eyes. Charmaine, what exactly did you tell the caseworker? I told her about the noise at night, about seeing Lainey with marks on her arms, about that Declan character being there all the time. Charmaine paused. Why? Didn't she include that in the report? No, she didn't. But that's impossible. I signed a statement. David's jaw tightened. Charmaine, did this caseworker seem interested in what you had to say? Well, now that you mention it, she seemed like she was in a hurry. Kept checking her watch, cutting me off when I tried to give details. What did she look like? Young, blonde, very professional looking. Expensive handbag, nice car. David felt pieces clicking into place. Charmaine, I don't think that woman was from CPS. What are you saying? I'm saying Melinda has more resources than we thought. After hanging up, David sat in his darkened office, staring at Caleb's photo. The system had failed. The people who were supposed to protect children had been bought, threatened, or fooled. But David was neither bought nor fooled. And he was done being patient. He picked up his phone and dialed Detective Lastra. It's David Callahan. We need to meet. Tonight. What happened? CPS closed the case. And I think I know why. An hour later, they sat in David's office, the overhead light casting harsh shadows across their faces. You're saying someone impersonated a CPS worker? Lastra asked. I'm saying my neighbor gave a statement to someone who wasn't Janet Mills. Someone who made sure that statement never made it into the official report. Lastra rubbed his forehead. If that's true, then we're dealing with people who have serious resources and serious motivation to keep this quiet. Which brings us back to Caleb's death. Yeah, it does. Lastra pulled out a file folder. I've been digging into that tow truck driver Declan Rudd. He's got a clean record, but his business associates are interesting. How interesting? The kind of interesting that involves offshore accounts and missing tax records. Rudd's towing company does work for several auto auction houses, including one that's been under federal investigation for insurance fraud. David leaned forward. You think he's done this before? Caused accidents for insurance money. I think Declan Rudd is exactly the kind of man who would tamper with brake lines for the right price. And Melinda provided the price. That's what we need to prove. Lastrom met David's eyes. But we need to be smart about this. If they killed your brother and covered it up once, they won't hesitate to do it again. What do you suggest? We make them think they've won. Let them get comfortable. And then we set a trap. David spent the next week playing the part of a broken man. He stayed away from Laney, didn't call Melinda, and even spread word around town that he was thinking of selling the shop and leaving Boise. To anyone watching, David Callahan was a grieving brother who'd finally accepted defeat. But late at night, he and Detective Lastra worked. Lastra had pulled Declan's phone records from the night of Caleb's death. The official story was that Declan had been home when he heard the crash and rushed to help. But the cell tower data told a different story. Look at this, Lastra said, pointing to a printout. Declan's phone pinged a tower 2 miles from the crash site at 11:47 p.m. The 911 call about the accident came in at 11:52, meaning he was already in the area when it happened. Gets better. 3 days before the crash, Declan's phone was in contact with Melinda's for 47 minutes. The call was made from the auto auction house where Caleb worked. David studied the timeline. He was casing the place, learning Caleb's schedule, figuring out when he'd be driving home alone. That's my guess. But we need more than phone records. We need proof of the affair, proof they planned this together. How do we get that? Lastra smiled grimly. We give them a reason to talk. The plan was simple but dangerous. David would approach Declan directly, claiming he wanted to make peace for Laney's sake. He'd offered Declan money a substantial amount to convince Melinda to let him see his niece again. The meeting would be recorded, and Lastra would be nearby with backup. If Declan was as arrogant as they suspected, he might let something slip about Caleb's death. You sure about this? Lastra asked as they reviewed the plan one more time. If he smells a trap, he won't. Men like Declan think they're smarter than everyone else. That's their weakness. 2 nights later, David called Declan's cell phone. Rudd towing. Declan? This is David Callahan, Caleb's brother. A pause. Yeah, I know who you are. What do you want? To talk. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Did we? I don't remember getting on any foot with you. David forced himself to sound tired, defeated. Look, I've been thinking about what's best for Laney. Maybe I was out of line, making accusations. Maybe I need to accept that you and Melinda are together now. Another pause, longer this time. You're saying you want to make peace? I'm saying I want what's best for my niece. And fighting with her mother isn't helping anyone. What did you have in mind? Meet me at my shop tomorrow night. 8 o'clock. We'll talk. Just talk. I'm not looking for trouble, Declan. I just want to see my niece again. Declan was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, there was something calculating in his voice. All right, 8 o'clock. But this better not be some kind of setup. It's not. I'm done fighting. The next evening, David waited in his shop office, a small recording device hidden in his desk drawer. Detective Lastra and 2 patrol officers were positioned outside, ready to move if things went wrong. Exactly 8 o'clock. Declan walked through the shop door. He was a big man, over 6 feet tall with cold blue eyes and the kind of build that came from hard physical work. He looked around the shop with obvious disdain. Nice place, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. It pays the bills. David gestured to a chair. Have a seat. Declan remained standing. So what's this about? You said you wanted to make peace. I do. For Laney's sake. David pulled out an envelope and set it on the desk. There's $5,000 in there. It's yours if you can convince Melinda to let me see my niece again. Declan's eyebrows rose. $5,000, just to talk to Melinda, just to make this right. I know I've been difficult. I know I've said things that upset her. But Laney needs family in her life. Declan picked up the envelope and looked inside. This is real money. Very real. And all I have to do is convince Melinda to play nice. That's all. Declan sat down now, his posture relaxing. You know what your problem is, Callahan? You never knew when to quit. Your brother had the same problem. David kept his face neutral. What do you mean? Caleb never knew when to back down. Always sticking his nose where it didn't belong. asking questions nobody wanted answered. Declan's smile was cold. Look where it got him. Caleb died in a car accident. Did he? Declan leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself. Or did he die because he couldn't mind his own business? David's heart pounded, but he kept his voice steady. I don't understand. Of course you don't. You Marines, all muscle and no brains. Declan pocketed the envelope. But here's the thing, I like you better than your brother. You know when you're beat. Are you saying Caleb's death wasn't an accident? Declan's smile widened. I'm saying some accidents are more accidental than others. And some people are too stupid to see the difference. The recording device was getting everything. David had to fight to keep his expression neutral. Melinda must have been grateful when Caleb died, David said carefully. Grateful? Declan laughed. She was the one who suggested it. Said she was tired of being married to a drunk nobody. Said she wanted to start fresh. With you, with me, and my money, and my connections. Declan's eyes grew cold. Your brother was holding her back. Holding all of us back. So you killed him. I made a problem go away. He was a drunk idiot anyway. We made it quick. David's hands clenched under the desk. And now we have his kid to deal with. But don't worry, that problem's going to solve itself soon enough. What do you mean? Declan stood up, his relaxed demeanor shifting to something more predatory. I mean, little Laney's been having some accidents lately. Clumsy kid, just like her old man. These things happen. David's blood went cold. You're threatening a child. I'm explaining reality. You keep your mouth shut, take your money, and stay away from our family. Or that little girl might have a very unfortunate accident. And if I don't? Declan's hand moved to his jacket, and David caught a glimpse of metal underneath. Then you'll join your brother a lot sooner than you planned. That's when Detective Lastra and the other officers burst through the door. Boise police. Hands where we can see them. Declan spun around, his hand going for his gun, but he was too slow. Two officers tackled him to the ground while Lastra secured his weapon. Declan Rudd, you're under arrest for the murder of Caleb Callahan and conspiracy to commit murder, Lastra said, reading him his rights. Yes, they hauled Declan away. He looked back at David with pure hatred. This isn't over. Yes, David said quietly, it is. Within hours of Declan's arrest, Detective Lastra had obtained search warrants for both Rudd, towing, and Melinda's house. The evidence they found painted a picture of calculated murder and systematic abuse that shocked even veteran investigators. T. Declan's business. They discovered detailed records of insurance fraud dating back 5 years, cars deliberately damaged, accidents staged, claims filed for vehicles that had never been in crashes. Caleb's file was there too, with photos of his car's brake system and handwritten notes about modifications needed. But it was Declan's phone that provided the most damning evidence. Text messages between him and Melinda going back 18 months showed their affair in graphic detail, along with increasingly desperate discussions about the Caleb problem. The messages revealed the scope of their plan. Melinda, he's getting suspicious. Found some of our photos. Declan, time to move. Can't wait any longer. Melinda, make it look clean. I can't handle questions. Declan, trust me, I've done this before. There were dozens more, each one another nail in their coffins. Detective Lastra sat across from David in the police station, spreading photos and documents across his desk like cards in a deadly game. We got them cold, Lastra said. Murder, insurance fraud, child abuse, conspiracy, the works. What about Laney? She's safe. We removed her from the home this morning. Emergency placement with a foster family until this gets sorted out. David's jaw tightened. I want her with me. I know you do. And given the circumstances, that'll probably happen. But there's paperwork, background checks, formal custody proceedings. It takes time. How much time? A few weeks, maybe a month. The system moves slow, but it does move. David nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to go find Laney immediately. After everything she'd been through, being with strangers, even kind strangers, had to be terrifying. What's the timeline for trial? Declan's talking, Lastra said. Trying to cut a deal. Claims Melinda was the mastermind. Says he was just following orders. Is that working? Lastra's smile was grim. Not even a little bit. We've got recordings of him bragging about the murder, text messages showing he initiated most of the planning, and physical evidence that he personally tampered with your brother's car. And Melinda, she's playing the grieving widow, claims she was being abused by Declan, forced to go along with his plans. Says she never wanted Caleb dead. David's hands clenched into fists. But the text messages show her to be an enthusiastic participant in planning her husband's murder. Yeah, her story's not holding up either. The office door opened, and a prosecutor David didn't recognize walked in a severe-looking woman in her 40s carrying a thick file folder. "Mr. Callahan? I'm District Attorney Sarah Walsh. I wanted to speak with you about the Pierce case." David stood and shook her hand. "What do you need from me?" "Your testimony, for starters. But more than that, I want you to understand what we're dealing with." Walsh sat down and opened her file. Melinda Pierce isn't just an abusive mother who helped kill her husband. She's a predator who's been operating under our noses for years. "What do you mean?" "We found evidence that she's been filing fraudulent insurance claims on Laney for the past 3 years. Fake medical bills, staged accidents, exaggerated injuries. She's collected over $30,000 by systematically abusing her own daughter." David felt sick. She was profiting from hurting Laney. More than that, the insurance investigator found a pattern. Every time Laney showed signs of recovering emotionally, there would be a new accident. A fall down the stairs, a bike crash, a burn from the stove. Always just severe enough to require medical attention. Never quite severe enough to trigger a full investigation. She was keeping Laney traumatized on purpose. It looks that way. Traumatized children don't ask questions. They don't tell adults what's really happening at home. And they generate sympathy and money from insurance companies. David's vision went red. Where is she now? County lockup. Bail was denied. Walsh met his eyes. "Mr. Callahan, I need you to know I'm going for the maximum on every charge. Murder in the first degree, child abuse, insurance fraud, conspiracy. If I have my way, neither one of them will see the outside of a prison cell again." "Good, but I need your help. The defense is going to paint you as an unstable veteran with PTSD who became obsessed with conspiracy theories after his brother's death. They'll say you manipulated evidence, coached your niece, maybe even planted the recording equipment yourself." David's expression was stone. "Let them try. You're confident. I'm confident in the truth. And I'm confident that a jury will see through their lies." Walsh smiled for the first time since entering the room. "I like your certainty. We're going to need it." The trial began 3 months later in a courthouse packed with reporters and spectators. The case had attracted national attention, a story of abuse, murder, and betrayal that seemed torn from movie script. David testified on the 3rd day, his military bearing and calm demeanor impressing the jury. He told them about Laney's fear, about the sketchbook, about the recordings that had captured Melinda's cruelty in stark detail. The defense attorney, a slick-talking man named Morrison, tried to rattle him during cross-examination. "Mr. Callahan, isn't it true that you've been receiving treatment for PTSD since your discharge from the Marines?" "Yes." "And isn't it true that PTSD can cause paranoia, hallucinations, and aggressive behavior?" "It can. It hasn't in my case." "But how would you know? Isn't denial a common symptom?" District Attorney Walsh objected before David could answer, but Morrison had made his point, or tried to. David looked directly at the jury. "I know the difference between my memories of combat and what I witnessed happening to my niece. One haunts me. The other motivates me." When the prosecution played the recording of Declan's confession, several jurors visibly recoiled. The cold calculation in his voice, the casual way he described murdering Caleb, the threats against Laney, it was devastating testimony. But it was Melinda's own words that sealed her fate. The prosecution had obtained a recording from the county jail, a phone call Melinda made to her sister the night after her arrest. In it, she revealed her true nature with shocking clarity. "I don't understand why everyone's so upset," Melinda's voice said through the courtroom speakers. "Caleb was a loser anyway. I did that little brat a favor by getting rid of him." "Melinda, you can't say things like that," her sister's voice replied. "Why not? It's true. And now that stupid kid is going to ruin everything with her lies and her drawings. I should have gotten rid of her years ago." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe she should have had a more serious accident. Something permanent. The courtroom was dead silent when the recording ended. Even Melinda's defense attorney looked shaken. During Melinda's testimony, Walsh systematically destroyed her story. Every claim of abuse by Declan was contradicted by text messages showing her enthusiasm for their plans. Every denial of harming Laney was undercut by medical records and photographic evidence. The breaking point came when Walsh presented Laney's sketchbook to the jury, page by page, explaining what each drawing meant. The progression from normal childhood art to documentation of systematic abuse was clear and heartbreaking. "Mrs. Pierce," Walsh said, holding up a drawing of a woman with wild hair screaming at a small figure. "Can you explain to the jury what might have inspired your daughter to draw this?" Melinda's composure finally cracked. She's always been a difficult child, always making things up, always trying to get attention. I did my best with her, but she's just like her father, weak and stupid and— "Your Honor," Morrison interrupted, trying to control his client. But Melinda was beyond control now. Months of maintaining her facade had taken their toll, and the mask was slipping. "You want to know the truth?" Melinda shouted, pointing at the sketchbook. "The truth is that little brat killed my husband. If she hadn't been such a burden, such a constant problem, he never would have been driving that night. She's the reason he's dead. Mrs. Pierce, please." Morrison begged. "No, I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of acting like I care about a kid who ruined my life. She deserved everything she got, and more." The courtroom erupted. The judge called for order while Morrison frantically tried to approach his client. But Melinda wasn't finished. "And you know what the best part is?" she screamed, her face twisted with rage. "Even if I go to prison, that little freak will never forget what I did to her. She'll never be normal. I broke her, and that's something I'll always have." The judge's gavel rang out like gunshots as bailiffs moved to restrain Melinda. But the damage was done. In less than 5 minutes, she had destroyed any sympathy the jury might have had for her. David watched from the gallery, his expression unchanging. This was who Melinda really was, not the grieving widow or the manipulated victim, but a predator who took pleasure in hurting a defenseless child. Walsh approached the witness stand as order was restored. "Mrs. Pierce, do you have anything else you'd like to tell the jury?" Melinda glared at her with pure hatred. "Yeah, I hope that kid never sleeps peacefully again." The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours, guilty on all counts. Melinda Pierce was sentenced to 25 years to life for first-degree murder, with additional sentences for child abuse, insurance fraud, and conspiracy running consecutively. With good behavior, she might be eligible for parole when she was 73 years old. Declan Rudd received life without parole. His history of insurance fraud and the premeditated nature of Caleb's murder had convinced the judge that he represented a permanent threat to society. 6 months after the trial ended, David stood in the courtroom again, this time for a custody hearing. Laney sat beside him, no longer the terrified, withdrawn child he'd first tried to help. She still had nightmares, still flinched at sudden movements, but she was healing. The judge, an elderly man named Harrison who'd seen too many broken families, looked down at them with kind eyes. "Mr. Callahan, the court has reviewed your petition for permanent guardianship of Laney Pierce. Given the circumstances of this case and the testimony of the child's therapist, this court is prepared to grant that petition." David felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "Thank you, Your Honor. However," Judge Harrison continued, "I want to make something clear. This child has been through trauma that most adults couldn't survive. She's going to need continued therapy, patience, and understanding. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" "Yes, sir." "And Miss Pierce," the judge said, addressing Laney directly, "how do you feel about living with your uncle permanently?" Laney looked up at David, then back at the judge. When she spoke, her voice was small but steady. "He saved me. I want to stay with him. Then it's settled." Full custody is awarded to David Callahan. Outside the courthouse, reporters clustered around them like vultures. David shielded Laney from the cameras and microphones, but one reporter managed to get close enough to shout a question. "Mr. Callahan, do you forgive Melinda Pierce for what she did to your family?" David stopped walking. For a moment, he considered ignoring the question. Then he turned to face the reporter, his expression granite hard. "Forgiveness is for the weak," he said quietly. "She'll die in a box. That's what she earned." The reporter looked taken aback. "But don't you think? I think she tortured child for years and murdered my brother for money. I think justice was served. And I think that's all that matters." He turned away from the cameras and walked toward his truck. Laney's small hand is a S. They drove home. Laney spoke for the first time since leaving the courthouse. "Uncle David." "Yeah, kiddo. I used to think it was my fault. What happened to Dad? What Mom did to me?" David glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting her eyes. "And now I know they were just bad people. And bad people don't get to win." David smiled, the first real smile he'd managed since Caleb's death. "No, they don't. Do you think Dad would be proud of us? I think your dad would be proud of how brave you were, how you helped catch the people who hurt him." Laney was quiet for a moment. "I miss him. I miss him too. But I'm glad I have you." David's throat tightened. "I'm glad I have you too, sweetheart." They drove home through the Idaho evening, the setting sun painting the sky in shades of gold and red. Behind them lay a courtroom where justice had finally been served. Ahead lay a future that would never be easy, but would be theirs to build together. In his rearview mirror, David could see the courthouse growing smaller and smaller until it disappeared entirely. But the memory of Melinda's rage-twisted face, the sound of Declan's cruel laughter, the evidence of what they'd done to an innocent child, those would stay with him forever. Not as nightmares, but as reminders. Reminders that some people chose evil, that some damage could never be undone, that forgiveness was a luxury the guilty didn't deserve, and reminders that sometimes, if you were strong enough and smart enough and just refused to give up, the bad guys actually lost. Yes, they pulled into the driveway of what was now officially Laney's home. David made a silent promise to his brother. Caleb would never see his daughter grow up, would never teach her to drive or walk her down the aisle or meet his grandchildren. But Laney would grow up safe. She would know she was loved. She would understand that what happened to her wasn't her fault, and that the people who hurt her had paid the price. That would have to be enough to it was all they had left. But sometimes, David thought as he watched Laney run toward the house, where she would never again be afraid, sometimes all you had left was exactly what you needed.